An overworked businessman rushes to catch the last train home after a long, exhausting day. The train is delayed, exacerbating his stress as he worries about work deadlines, financial concerns, and an uncertain future. Frustrated, he boards the train, unaware that this journey will change his perspective on life and make it clear why you shouldn't worry about tomorrow. Leo checked his watch again, tapping his foot impatiently as he stood on the dimly lit platform, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders like an invisible burden he couldn't shake. His phone buzzed in his pocket, another email notification reminding him of a missed deadline, another obligation he hadn't met, another reason to feel like he was falling behind in a race he never signed up for. He sighed, rubbing his temples, willing the stress away, but the tension in his jaw refused to loosen. The announcement crackled over the intercom: his train was delayed. Of course it was. As if the universe had conspired to make his day just a little worse, as if time itself was against him. He stuffed his phone into his pocket and looked around, his fellow passengers standing in restless anticipation, mirroring his own frustration. A teenager slouched against the wall, glued to his screen, earbuds drowning out the world. A woman in a crisp suit paced back and forth, muttering into her Bluetooth earpiece, her movements sharp and precise, the embodiment of a person trying to control an uncontrollable world. A homeless man sat hunched over near a bench, cradling a cup of coffee, seemingly the only one unbothered by the delay. Leo exhaled sharply and turned away from them all, staring at the empty tracks, wishing the train would just arrive so he could go home, collapse into bed and prepare to do it all over again tomorrow. The air was thick with exhaustion, not just his own but the collective fatigue of a city that never stopped moving, never stopped worrying, never stopped chasing the next thing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the train's headlights sliced through the darkness, the distant rumble growing louder as it neared. Leo barely waited for the doors to slide open before stepping in, taking a seat near the window, desperate for a moment of silence, a moment where he didn't have to think. The carriage wasn't empty, but it was quiet, occupied by a handful of passengers who, like him, looked like they had carried the weight of their day onto the train. The overhead lights flickered as the doors closed with a hiss, and the train lurched forward, pulling out of the station. Leo leaned back, exhaling deeply, but the knot in his chest remained, the worries clinging to him like vines he couldn't untangle. His mind ran through the same cycle it did every night: projects left unfinished, clients unsatisfied, promotions slipping through his fingers, bills stacking up like an insurmountable wall. He thought about tomorrow, the next day, the next year, trying to map out every possible problem and solution, trying to stay ahead of the unpredictable chaos of life. He closed his eyes for a moment, wishing not for the first time that he could just stop thinking, just stop worrying, just stop feeling like everything was spiraling out of control. But then a voice, soft, weathered, carrying the weight of years, broke through the silence, pulling him out of his head. "You know," the voice said, "I used to be just like you." Leo opened his eyes, startled, and turned to see an elderly man seated across from him, his kind eyes twinkling with something Leo couldn't quite place. "What do you mean?" Leo asked, surprised by his own willingness to engage. The old man smiled, leaning back as the train rocked gently forward. "Worried all the time. Always thinking about tomorrow. But one day I learned something that changed everything." Leo frowned, skeptical, but for the first time that night his mind quieted just a little as he listened. The train rocked gently as it cut through the night, its rhythmic clatter against the rails the only sound filling the quiet carriage. Leo studied the old man across from him, curiosity laced with skepticism, wondering what wisdom this stranger thought he could impart that would make any difference to the relentless storm raging inside his mind. The elderly man had a worn but warm face, deep wrinkles carved by time and experience, yet his eyes held a glimmer of something Leo couldn't quite name, something light, unburdened, almost as if he had discovered a secret the rest of the world had yet to learn. He adjusted the thick woolen coat draped over his frail shoulders, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he had long ago abandoned the rush that everyone else seemed trapped in. Leo glanced at his phone out of habit, catching the time, later than he'd hoped. More emails had stacked up in his inbox, a relentless tide of responsibilities waiting to drown him the moment he stepped off the train, but something in the old man's presence made him hesitate before slipping the device back into his pocket. The old man chuckled softly as if reading his thoughts. "Funny thing about time," he mused, folding his hands over his lap, It moves forward whether you chase it or not. Leo shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the unsolicited insight, yet unable to ignore it. That's supposed to mean something? He muttered, not sure why he was entertaining this conversation instead of retreating into his usual spiral of stress. The man's smile didn't waver. Depends on whether you're willing to listen, he said, his voice carrying the kind of patience that could only be earned through years of living. I used to be just like you once. Always looking ahead, always worried about what was next. Thought if I planned enough, worked hard enough, I could control the future. But do you know what I learned after all that time? He let the question hang in the air, giving Leo the space to ignore it, to dismiss him as just another talkative passenger, but something about the weight behind his words made Leo bite. What? He asked, almost against his will. The old man's gaze didn't waver. That none of it ever really belonged to me, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The future, I mean. We like to think we own it, that if we stress enough, prepare enough, we can shape it to our liking. But the truth is, it's never ours to hold. Leo scoffed, shaking his head. That's easy to say when you're not the one with deadlines and bills and expectations breathing down your neck. He regretted the sharpness in his tone the moment the words left his mouth, but the old man didn't seem offended. If anything, he looked amused. You think I never had those things? He asked, tilting his head slightly. I spent my whole life in business just like you. Worked in finance, climbed the ladder, did everything I thought I was supposed to do. I had a house bigger than I needed, a car that cost too much, and a schedule that never let me breathe. And do you know what happened when I got older? Leo shook his head, despite himself. None of it mattered, the old man said, his voice soft but absolute. The money, the promotions, the years I spent trading my peace for a sense of security that was never really secure. I lost time with my family, lost chances to enjoy the world while I still had the energy to explore it. And when I finally stepped away from it all, I realized I had spent decades chasing a tomorrow that never came the way I expected. Leo looked out the window, watching the dark landscape blur past, feeling the unease settle deeper in his chest. He didn't want to admit how much of himself he saw in the old man's words. So what are you saying? He asked, forcing himself to sound indifferent. That I should just stop caring? Stop working? The old man chuckled, shaking his head. No, son. I'm saying you should stop believing that worrying is the same thing as preparing. Stop letting your fears of the unknown steal the only thing you actually have. This moment, right here. He tapped his fingers against the worn leather armrest, his expression unreadable. I wasted too much of my life living in tomorrows that never came. And in the end, all I had were yesterdays filled with regrets. Leo swallowed, the weight of the conversation pressing against him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He wanted to argue, to explain why his stress was different, why he couldn't just let go like it was that simple. But before he could find the words, the train hit a slight turn, and the overhead lights flickered, casting the cabin in brief shadow before settling again. The old man's face, illuminated once more, held no traces of regret, only the steady calm of someone who had already made peace with what Leo was still fighting. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts, and for the first time in a long time, Leo had nothing to say. The train rumbled forward, carrying its passengers deeper into the night, and Leo found himself staring absently at his reflection in the window, the old man's words lingering in his mind longer than he wanted to admit. The idea of surrendering control over the future unsettled him, yet a small part of him recognized the truth in it. But before he could dwell too deeply on his thoughts, movement from the seat across the aisle caught his attention. A young woman, no older than 25, was flipping through a sketchbook, her fingers stained with charcoal, her clothes casual and loose, a stark contrast to the stiff business attire Leo had worn every day for as long as he could remember. She was humming softly, the kind of quiet tune people hum when they don't care who's listening, her posture relaxed as if she had no place she urgently needed to be. Leo barely noticed when the old man stood and shuffled away toward another part of the train, leaving the space between them open. The young woman glanced up, catching Leo's gaze before he could look away. Instead of ignoring him, she grinned, holding up the sketchbook as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Want to see? She asked, her voice light, brimming with unguarded enthusiasm. Leo hesitated, then gave a small nod, and she turned the book toward him. The pages were filled with a collection of faces, places, fleeting moments captured in bold, expressive strokes. A street performer caught mid-dance, an old couple sharing a quiet meal, a woman leaning against a train window, lost in thought. Each image pulsed with something alive, something real. "You drew all these?" he asked, unable to mask his surprise. She nodded, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "Yep. I sketch people I see on my travels. Everyone's got a story, even if they don't realize it." Leo studied the images again, seeing the depth in each one, the way she had somehow managed to capture a kind of unspoken truth in every line. "You do this for a living?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could think about it. She laughed, shaking her head. "Not exactly. I used to think I had to choose between making a living and making art. For a while I picked the safe option. Marketing job, stable paycheck, benefits, the whole thing. But I hated it. Every day felt like I was slowly suffocating, like I was becoming someone I didn't even recognize. I spent so much time worrying about what might happen if I failed as an artist that I didn't realize I was already failing at being happy." She flipped to another page, a self-portrait. Her eyes filled with uncertainty, her shoulders tense. A version of herself that looked like it carried the weight of invisible expectations. "Then one day I just stopped," she continued, her voice quieter now. "I quit. Bought a train pass. Started sketching full-time. Not because it made sense, not because I had a perfect plan, but because I realized I was more afraid of spending my whole life waiting for the right moment than I was of failing." Leo frowned, the thought jarring something loose inside him. "That's reckless," he said before he could stop himself. "What if you can't make enough? What if you regret it later?" She only smiled, as if she had heard the question 100 times before. "Then I'll figure it out," she said simply. "But at least I won't look back wondering what would have happened if I had just tried." She leaned back against the seat, stretching her arms over her head, unburdened by the doubts that clung so stubbornly to Leo's own mind. "You know, people always act like they need to have everything figured out before they take a risk. But life doesn't work that way. You make a choice, you take a step, and you adjust as you go. Worrying about the future doesn't stop bad things from happening. It just keeps you from living while you're waiting." Leo looked at her, trying to find the flaw in her logic, trying to come up with some counterargument that would make her words less true. But all he could think about was how exhausted he felt, how long he had been running in circles, making decisions based on fear instead of desire. He had spent years convincing himself that he was being responsible by putting security before passion, yet here was someone who had done the opposite, and she looked freer than he had ever felt. The train jolted slightly as it sped past a cluster of city lights in the distance, and the young woman turned her attention back to her sketchbook, as if the conversation had been nothing more than a passing breeze. But Leo couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something small but undeniable, a whisper of possibility in the back of his mind that hadn't been there before. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. The train continued its steady journey through the night. The outside world nothing but a blur of distant city lights and endless darkness stretching beyond the window. The air in the cabin was thick with quiet reflection, and Leo felt the weight of the artist's words still pressing against the edges of his thoughts. He glanced over at her, watching as she lost herself in another sketch, completely absorbed in the moment in a way that felt foreign to him. Before he could dwell on it, a gentle yet weary voice from the seat beside him cut through the quiet. "You remind me of my son," the woman said, her tone soft but carrying an undeniable sadness. Leo turned to face her, taken slightly off guard. She was middle-aged, dressed in a navy coat that looked well-worn from years of use, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes, deep and dark, held a kind of grief that had settled in, not as something temporary but as a part of her. He wasn't sure how to respond, but she offered a small, almost apologetic smile before continuing. "He worried about everything just like you. Always thinking ahead, always planning for things that might never happen. Used to drive me crazy when he was little. He would lie awake at night asking me questions about things that were years away. What school he would go to, what job he would have, if he'd be successful. I would tell him to stop worrying, to just enjoy being a child, but it was like he didn't know how." She exhaled, her fingers tightening briefly before relaxing again. "It didn't get better when he got older. The worries just changed. He spent years trying to secure a future that he wasn't even sure he wanted, as if making all the right choices would somehow protect him from life's unpredictability. He was always waiting for the right time, to travel, to fall in love, to take chances. But time doesn't wait for us to be ready." Her voice wavered slightly, and she turned her gaze toward the window, as if trying to steady herself against the weight of her own words. He died last year. Car accident. Just like that, gone. Leo felt his stomach tighten, his throat dry as he searched for something to say, but she shook her head as if to stop him before he could offer an empty condolence. I spent years worrying about him, about whether he would be happy, about whether he was making the right choices. And he spent years worrying about what came next instead of just living. And in the end, neither of us got the time we thought we had. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it, only a tired acceptance. I used to tell him that worrying too much about the future steals the joy of the present. I must have said it 1,000 times. But I don't think he ever truly believed me. And now, all I can do is wonder what his life could have been like if he had just let himself live. The words settled heavily between them, thick with an unbearable truth that Leo didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. He thought about all the times he had pushed things off for the sake of responsibility, all the moments he had missed because he had been too preoccupied with what might happen tomorrow. He thought about how often he had told himself that he would take a break once things settled down, once he reached the next milestone, once he felt secure enough to step back, only to find that the finish line kept moving, always just out of reach. I know you don't know me, the woman said after a long pause, her eyes meeting his with quiet intensity, but if I could tell you one thing, if I could make you understand something my son never did, it would be this. You are not in control of time. You can plan, you can prepare, you can try to build the safest future possible, but in the end life happens whether you're ready or not. Don't waste it all waiting for the perfect moment. There's no such thing. Her words struck something deep within him, something he had spent years ignoring, dismissing, pushing aside in favor of logic and responsibility. He wanted to argue, to insist that he needed to be careful, that he couldn't just abandon all sense of stability, that planning for the future was the only way to ensure it wouldn't fall apart. But instead all he could think about was how fragile everything truly was, how easily life could slip through his fingers while he was too busy worrying to hold on to it. The train rumbled over a bridge, the faint reflection of city lights dancing across the window, and Leo let out a slow breath, feeling for the first time the sheer weight of all the years he had spent in his own head. The woman beside him didn't expect a response. She simply stared out the window, lost in her own memories, her grief now a permanent passenger on whatever train she happened to be on. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Leo found himself without an argument, without a reason to dismiss what he had just heard. Because deep down he knew she was right. The rhythmic hum of the train filled the quiet space between the passengers, a soft, unrelenting reminder that time, like the rails beneath them, never truly stopped. Leo sat in contemplative silence, the weight of the grieving mother's words settling deep into his chest, pressing against years of ingrained fears and routines that had ruled his life. He felt an exhaustion that went beyond the long day, beyond the deadlines, beyond the endless cycle of stress that had become his normal. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from realizing that he had spent years trying to outrun an uncertain future instead of simply living in the present. He let out a slow breath, his fingers tracing over the edge of his phone, but for the first time in years he didn't reach for it. He didn't check his emails, didn't scroll through messages, didn't search for the next thing to prepare for. Instead he just sat there, staring at the worn-out fabric of the seat in front of him, listening to the steady hum of the world moving around him. A soft cough drew his attention, and when he looked up he saw the train conductor standing a few rows away, adjusting his cap as he moved methodically through the carriage. He was an older man, sturdy but relaxed, with the kind of presence that suggested he had spent more time observing life than trying to control it. He made his way down the aisle, pausing to check tickets, nodding politely to passengers, but when his gaze landed on Leo something shifted. There was a knowing look in his eyes, something deep and unspoken, as if he had already seen 100 men like Leo before, sitting in these same seats, lost in their own tangled worries. He stepped closer, pausing at Leo's row and tapped the edge of his hat in greeting. "Long night?" he asked, his voice carrying the easy warmth of someone who had long since made peace with life's unpredictability. Leo hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Something like that." The conductor chuckled, shifting his weight as he leaned slightly against the seat across from Leo. "Funny thing about this job," he mused, glancing briefly down the length of the train. "I've been working these tracks for more years than I care to count. Watched all kinds of people come and go from every walk of life. And you know what I've noticed? Leo raised an eyebrow, unsure if he was meant to answer. The conductor didn't wait for him to. Most folks ride this train like it's just a way to get somewhere. They sit in their seats, stare at their watches, count the minutes till they arrive. But every once in a while you get someone who realizes something different. Something important. He shifted slightly, his expression thoughtful. See, life ain't about the destination, son. It's about the ride. Leo scoffed softly, shaking his head. That sounds like something people say when they don't have deadlines breathing down their neck. The conductor grinned, unbothered by Leo's skepticism. Maybe. Or maybe it's just something you don't understand yet. He folded his arms, his gaze steady. You ever notice how people get so caught up in where they're going that they forget they're already somewhere? Always thinking ahead, always planning the next stop, the next goal, the next big thing. But while they're doing that, they miss everything happening around them. The little moments. The conversations. The simple joys of just being here. Leo felt his jaw tighten, his mind instinctively reaching for an argument, for some way to push back against what the conductor was saying. But he didn't have one. Because he knew deep down that he was exactly that kind of person. Always moving, always calculating, always looking ahead to the next checkpoint in his life as if happiness and fulfillment were things that could only exist in some distant future version of himself. The conductor sighed, adjusting his hat again. I've seen folks spend their whole lives waiting to start living. They tell themselves they'll be happy once they get that promotion, once they buy that house, once they retire. But then one day they look back and realize they spent all their time waiting and none of it actually living. He shook his head, a soft chuckle escaping him. And you know the ones who seem the most at peace. The ones who don't worry so much about the end of the line. They just enjoy the journey while they're on it. He glanced at Leo then, something quiet and knowing in his gaze. I reckon you've been riding through life with your eyes fixed on the next stop for a long time now. But maybe, just maybe, it's time to look out the window instead. With that he gave a small nod, a final tip of his hat and moved on, leaving Leo sitting there, the words echoing in his mind, unraveling years of tightly wound expectations. He thought about all the times he had put his happiness on hold, convincing himself that he would enjoy life once things were under control, once he had everything figured out, once there were no more uncertainties. But what if that moment never came? What if there would always be something else, some new goal, some new problem, some new worry keeping him from appreciating what was already here? The train rattled gently as it continued down the tracks, and for the first time in a long, long time, Leo wondered what it would feel like to stop running toward the future and just exist in the present. The train rocked gently as it neared its final destination, the hum of the tracks beneath it steady and rhythmic, like the ticking of an unseen clock winding down the night. Leo sat still, staring at his reflection in the window, but for the first time in a long time he wasn't seeing himself through the lens of deadlines, obligations, or the endless race toward an uncertain future. He saw something else, something unfamiliar, something unburdened. The words of the old man, the young artist, the grieving mother, and the train conductor wove together in his mind, forming a picture that was both unsettling and undeniable. They had each offered him something, a lesson he hadn't known he needed, a truth he had spent years running from. He thought about the old man's quiet acceptance, the way he had looked at life as something to be experienced rather than controlled. He thought about the artist's boldness, her refusal to let fear dictate the shape of her life. He thought about the mother's sorrow, the deep ache of a future lost too soon, and the way her regrets had become a cautionary tale for those still grasping at time they thought they owned. And he thought about the conductor with his quiet wisdom and steady certainty, who had seen 1,000 people like Leo, all too consumed by their destination to notice the journey. The train's lights flickered slightly as it neared the station, and Leo let out a slow breath, feeling the remnants of his old self clinging to him like the last drops of a fading storm. The doors would open soon. The world would demand his attention again. Emails, meetings, responsibilities. All waiting for him the moment he stepped off. But something had shifted, something irreversible. He could feel it in the quiet beat of his heart, in the looseness of his shoulders, in the way his mind, for once, wasn't racing ahead of the moment he was in. He glanced around the carriage, his gaze lingering on the faces of the strangers who had, in the span of a single train ride, reshaped the way he saw his own life. The old man had dozed off, his head tilted slightly to the side, a peaceful expression on his face as if he had long ago learned how to rest in a world that never stopped moving. The young artist was still sketching, completely absorbed in her craft, unbothered by anything outside of the present moment. The grieving mother sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant but steady, as if she had found a small measure of peace in sharing her son's story with someone who had needed to hear it. And the conductor had disappeared down the length of the train, continuing his routine as if he had never truly stopped at all, as if he had known all along that the right words at the right time could change the course of someone's journey. The train slowed as it pulled into the station, and Leo felt a strange kind of clarity settle over him. Not an answer, not a perfectly outlined plan, but something lighter, something more free. He had spent years obsessing over things beyond his control, chaining himself to an endless cycle of what-ifs and what-nexts, believing that if he just worked hard enough, planned carefully enough, worried enough, he could somehow secure a future that would always remain uncertain. But the truth was, no amount of worry could change the unpredictability of life. No amount of planning could guarantee the outcomes he sought. And in all his rushing toward the future, he had been missing the only thing that had ever truly belonged to him. Now. The train came to a full stop and the doors slid open with a quiet hiss. The station lights glowed in the darkness, casting long shadows across the platform. For a moment, Leo just sat there, unmoving, as if testing the weight of his own existence in this exact moment, free from the burden of what came next. Then slowly he stood. He adjusted his coat, took one last glance at the carriage that had, in some unspoken way, become a place of transformation, and stepped forward. As he crossed the threshold onto solid ground, he felt something shift inside him. A quiet resolve, a decision not to let his life pass him by while he was too busy worrying to live it. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of that. The train doors closed behind him, and with a low rumble, it pulled away from the station, carrying its passengers forward, each of them on their own journey, each of them choosing in their own way how to exist within the fleeting, unpredictable beauty of now.